So today's topic is going to be recurrent implantation failure. This is actually a very important topic, but it's very extensive, and much part of it, the evidence is not strong yet to recommend for or against the treatments. So I'll just try to be as brief as possible today. So first we'll start by discussing what is implantation. In case of an IVF cycle, let us say we transfer embryos. Unless you see a resulting gestational sac on the ultrasound, else it is called implantation failure. Because many might have this confusion, there's a thin line. Let us say you perform an IVF cycle and you do a beta HCG after 15 days after the transfer. You get some value. You get a beta HCG value like, let's say, 75. But then when you call her for a scan, you don't see a sac. That means it is a biochemical pregnancy. Biochemical pregnancy is also still considered as an implantation failure. It is not successful implantation. So even biochemical pregnancy losses, if they are there, it is considered as implantation failure. If you want to understand how to calculate an implantation rate, you have to find the number of sacs that are visible on the ultrasound. You divide it upon the total number of embryos that you actually transferred into the uterine cavity of the lady and multiply it by 100. For example, if you take day 3 embryos, let us say you have transferred 3 into her uterine cavity and she gets positive, and later on when you call her for scan, you're seeing only one sac. That means only one embryo implanted. So your implantation rate is going to be 1 by 3 into 100, which is around 33%. Now, across the centers, when they found that most of the times when they were transferring day 2 or day 3 embryos, the implantation rate was usually around 25%. But if we are actually opting for day 5 or day 6 embryos, that is blastocysts, which is very obvious, the implantation rate is usually higher. Coming to definition, we all know for an IVF treatment, the bottleneck for an IVF success is embryo implantation. When we say implantation failure, so this is used to describe both the patients who have never shown quantifiable signs of implantation, such as increased levels of HCG, and those who have increased HCG, but without a later evidence of gestational sac in the uterus. So all these are considered as implantation failure. When you talk about a term implantation failure, it can be applicable to anybody, like an IUI treatment, ovulation induction treatment, or even people who are trying naturally. So probably in the body, there is an embryo that is forming, but it was not allowed to implant by the uterus. So implantation failure in general can be applicable to any person. But particularly when you talk about recurrent implantation failure, this kind of a term is only applicable to patients who are undergoing the assisted reproductive technique treatments. There are evolving definitions for RIF over time, because at one point of time, people were mainly doing day 3 transfers. Now the trend has moved towards day 5 transfers. And maybe at one point of time earlier, there were more number of embryos that are being transferred into the uterus each time. And the technology has been evolving. So the latest definition, or quite commonly used definition, is the final one, Kuglen et al. So that they say that if at least 3 or more transfers have been attempted in a lady, out of which at least 4 high-grade embryos have been transferred, be it fresh or frozen, and the age of the lady is under 40 years, then we can diagnose or give the term as recurrent implantation failure. Incidence. Incidence of recurrent implantation failure has been very vast across different studies. There are different people quoting it, but generally they say it is around 5 to 25% of the cycles. It is very variable. The causes of recurrent implantation failure. The moment you see that a lady is repeatedly failing the IVF cycle, or she is getting some beta value, but it is not ending up in a successful implantation or a sustained implantation, what could be the various causes? Before I go into the depth, mainly when a lady comes to us, let's say my case, it has come negative. When they come, I say broadly, reasons for the failure could be 3 things. Could be the embryo, it could be the uterus, or it could be the sperm. So broadly, we can divide it as this. So first, we will come to the causes as maternal age. We'll start from something very basic, not go too, but first age of the lady. Why age of the lady is so important? We all know as the age of the lady advances, in the older age group, what happens is more abnormal eggs are retrieved, and those abnormal eggs fertilized by sperms will result in higher aneuploid embryos. Now, the less quality embryos, there is a higher likelihood of not being able to implant. That's why we see that the maternal age, as it is advancing in the higher age groups, we see lower implantation rate. One study was conducted by Shapiro et al. They found there was higher rates of embryo endometrial asynchrony with increasing maternal age. 50% of the transfers were asynchronous in women of lesser age group, that is less than 35. On the other hand, in the more than 35 years age group, this same embryo endometrial asynchrony, when they studied, it was in a much higher percentage, almost 68%. After maternal age, next comes BMI. BMI is also important because women who are on the higher BMI, they require more gonadotropin doses. We usually get oocytes that are of lower quality, a compromised quality. The follicular development is also disturbed. So that's why even as a general term, BMI also can affect the implantation rates or the success rates to certain extent. Next, coming to smoking, chronic smokers. So all these ladies I'm talking about, they have low estradiol levels in their body even during ovarian stimulation. And all these toxins that are coming from the cigarette smoke, they go and disrupt the functioning of corpus luteum and also negatively impact the implantation of the embryo. Hence, the smoking patients usually have a decreased live birth rate, suggesting that it can have a negative impact on the overall pregnancy outcomes. Coming to stress. Now, stress is a common term that we all think that, yes, stress is bad, but is it positively reflecting in statistics? Is it really at present affecting the implantation rates? We do not know. They say that it can significantly affect, especially in successive cycles, not in the people who are attempting their first time fertility treatment, because usually most are very positive in their first attempt. It is only when they start seeing failures in even the higher advanced treatments of IVF, that's when they start sinking into depression, and that might greatly affect the results. This is a nice diagram where they say now uterus, it can be two things. It can be very receptive or it can be highly selective. Now there are uterus which are very receptive. That means it accepts any embryo that is given to it. So it doesn't really differentiate that is it a good embryo, is it a bad embryo, should I allow it to implant, should I not allow. So uterus which are having very high receptivity, they end up allowing all the whatever embryos that are being introduced into the uterus to implant. So eventually, even if the embryo does end up implanting, it will result in a miscarriage. So the miscarriage, you see, recurrent miscarriage ladies are those where their uterus is very receptive. Very fast, they'll keep getting pregnant, but it doesn't go forward well. Now, there are, on the other hand, there's another set of uterine which are highly selective. Now, in this very selective uterus, what happens is you give a very good embryo, even a euploid embryo, also at times it keeps rejecting it. So, high selectivity causes a increased delay and repetitive failures. Now, what we are discussing is a recurrent implantation failure, which usually is in cases where it is highly selective. Now, recurrent miscarriages are seen in uteri, which are highly receptive. Now, into the depth of evaluation and management. Now, we have only talked about very superficial causes like age, BMI, and smoking. Now, we'll talk which are more evidence based. Now, first, we have maternal causes, then we have other causes. In the maternal causes, first is anatomical, that is from the uterus end, what all can be done. Next is certain hereditary thrombophilias, which needs to be corrected with addition of blood thinners. Genetic basis, that is from the mother's egg, or it could be the husband's sperm, or it could be a resulting embryo, the genetics basically. Next is immunological. That is a whole other thing which is now being in a discussion a lot. I'll talk about it. Next, infections like chronic endometritis, and then altered molecules and endometrial receptivity. Now, about this last one, we do not have a lot of information at present, but this is more dealing at level where You do a GCSF or this endometrial scratching. What it does is it causes inflammation. So when there is inflammation, it invites all the neutrophils. So they say when all these neutrophils get concentrated in that area, they produce certain growth factors that are improving the vascularity or improving the quality of the endometrium. Next, other factors are coming from the embryo, the male factor, and sometimes even your IVF protocol, the type of drugs that you're using, the dosage with which you are stimulating the lady. So, multiple other things also. Now, all these factors have to be rechecked if a failure in result comes. And then, for the further treatment, you have to make a personalized treatment plan for that lady to give her the maximum chance of success in the subsequent cycle. First, coming to genetic testing. In genetic, first we assess the mother and the father. So, parental karyotyping. So, prevalence of chromosomal aberrations was seen in around 2 to 2.5% in the RIF population, which is much higher than a general population. So, when I say this chromosomal aberrations, we are not referring to abnormal number of chromosomes. Like, let's say ladies have 46 and men have 46XY. You usually do not find that somebody has 45 chromosomes or an extra chromosome like Klinefelters. No, that is not what we mean here. When we say chromosomal aberrations, we are talking about balanced, unbalanced translocation errors. So that might exist and you might not actually know it. So doing a karyotyping test for both mother and father is very important. So translocations being the commonest reason. Now we'll come to the oocyte. Now, how do you assess the oocyte quantity and quality? We can do certain tests like FSH, AMH, and look for the AFCs. The extremes of ovarian reserve, somebody with a very low ovarian reserve or somebody with high AMH like PCOD, both can have a compromised oocyte quality. That's how we are trying to give a uh, probably derive some information about the oocyte quality. Outright doesn't mean all the PCO people have poor quality oocytes. All the ladies who have low reserve will have poor quality oocytes. That is not what I mean. But probably we have to look into these factors as well. Next is sperm. From the sperm end, the semen analysis or the sperm function test is not giving you any information about the DNA that is being carried in the sperms. Generally, in IVF ICSI cycles, the embryologist sitting inside the lab is selecting the sperms which need to be injected into the oocytes. And how the embryologist makes the selection, she's only able to look for motile sperms, and at the best, she will look for the head and the tail, the morphology. She cannot see the DNA. So, how badly the DNA is injured, we need to understand. You can get a sperm DNA fragmentation test done. There are multiple tests for it. Some do SCD, sperm chromatin dispersion. Some do SCSA methods. Some do COMET test, tunnel test. There are multiple tests, different assays and different diagnostic centers. But generally, across all the tests, the acceptable level of DNA fragmentation, a good level, should be less than 15%. Then we have a gray zone that is 15 to 25%, which is slightly elevated, still fair enough. But above 25%, it's considered to be elevated DNA fragmentation. If you come across a cycle where there is a failed transfer and the husband shows a high DNA fragmentation, probably in the next plan, you should include different medication and lifestyle changes, first of all, to bring down the DNA fragmentation levels. And second, you can add on certain sperm selection techniques for selecting sperms with less DNA fragmentation. A few want to use things like microfluidics or PIXI, but some want to do TISA also. When very high DNA fragmentation, like even more than 50, sometimes if it is seen, then you can also advise for TISA because they say in testicular sperm aspiration, you are deriving sperms or directly from the site of origin. They have not yet been exposed to the external pollution, the heat and chemicals. So probably the DNA fragmentation is comparatively lower in the TISA sperm. So that is their justification for using TISA in such cases. Now embryo. Now, how do you test embryo? All of us know it is PGTA, which is pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy. We have other PGT techniques also like PGT-M, monogene disorders, and PGT-SR. Yes, I did not include in the slide, sorry, but PGT-SR structural rearrangements. We do it when the husband and wife karyotyping is showing the translocation errors. Then you have to do the PGT-SR. Next, time lapse. Time lapse is nothing but we have incubators where we leave the oocyte after ICSI. and then that's where it is culturing into a day 5 or a day 3 embryo, but you are not able to see the changes that are taking place inside the incubator. There's no real time imaging. So time lapse is what we do is every second, every minute, how the embryo is dynamically multiplying cells. That is what you can see in time lapse. So time lapse technique, what they do is they say in the embryo, let us say on day 5, I have two embryos. Which one should I select? And both of them are of the same grade. Both are AB or BB. But still, time lapse says this one during the formation, this was much faster, or during the formation, there were certain granules or certain inclusions that were seen and then disappeared. Something like that might be a criteria in not choosing this and choosing the other one. So, time lapse helps that. This can never be an alternative to the PGTA. It is probably just helping us to choose a better embryo when we have two embryos which are morphologically similar in terms of grade. Choosing a better one, maybe time lapse can come, but time lapse is quite costly, and still we can see that it is not available in all the centers across India. Very few places in India have it. Last is omics. Omics are transcriptomics, that is the RNA readings of the embryo. This is also at present not practiced much. So we can stick to at least PGT, because across India, even now, PGT being performed is hardly 10 to 15%, while abroad, almost all the embryos are usually screened by PGTA before going ahead for a transfer. There are studies, even by the American population. What they did was they were trying to see, is it justified to do PGTA for all the embryos, for all the cases. They found that in the younger ladies, that is young women less than 35, even without PGTA, if the lady at least is going for his first, second, or even by the third transfer, there is almost more than 90% chance of her conceiving even without PGT. Even now, PGT for all is not being recommended or voiced by any of the experts. We can use it only where it is indicated. Now, PGTA in recurrent implantation failure, is it improving the pregnancy rate? There were two large studies conducted for it. First one was an ESTEEM study, that is ESHRE study into the evaluation of oocyte euploidy by microarray analysis. What they did was they found that there was a lower miscarriage rate in the PGTA group per transfer in comparison to the controls. But this is not, this evidence cannot be admitted because they did polar body biopsy, while we do blastocyst trophectoderm biopsy. Next came STAR study, single embryo transfer of euploid embryo. No significant difference found in ongoing pregnancy rate and the live birth rate between PGTA group versus control group. So there is no difference. They are not supporting it. But what they did find is that in the people where they did PGTA and then only went for transfer, those people, many were of the embryos were found to be aneuploid. Few of them came mosaic. Few of them they came inconclusive results. So all of them were discarded. So they ultimately had lesser number of embryos for transfer. So they had lower cumulative pregnancy rate in comparison to the control group. Now control group, what happened was they had additional embryos, they came back for their second pregnancy or the second child, they had a higher cumulative pregnancy rate. That's why even now PGTA needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, and we need to find out, is it necessary to do it or not. Next is anatomical. In anatomical, we have first one is the uterine factors. Congenital, like septate uterus particularly, might affect the chances of ongoing pregnancy or live birth. There is septate, increased risk of miscarriages and also implantation failure. Second, acquired factors like fibroid, adenomyosis, endometrial polyp, intrauterine adhesions. I will not be going deep into each one because each one is its own class. Wherein you have a fibroid doesn't mean all the fibroids need resection, particularly submucosal fibroids or certain fibroids with larger dimensions or symptomatic fibroids. You see a subserosal fibroid which is 2 centimeters, you do not have to operate it. Even if the embryo transfer is negative, that cannot be the possible reason why she is getting negative. So those are the independent classes. You can go deep into it. Next is hydrosalpinx. When you see hydrosalpinx present, in few cases, the fluid comes into the uterus. You can see fluid in the cavity. Now, in such cases, it is justified to delink or remove the tubes and then only plan the next transfer. But There are at times where there is a non-communicating. There is a bilateral hydrosalpinx, but you do not see any fluid in your cavity. In such cases, it is at the discretion of the clinician whether to go forward or whether to still resort to bilateral tubal delinking. Many experts feel even if they do not see fluid in the cavity, they want to disconnect the tubes. Why they don't want to do that? Because they have gone in too deep. They have read endometrial molecular markers. We have something called like HOXA, home box. There are certain genes which are supposed to be upregulated or downregulated to favor the implantation of an embryo. Now we have certain genes which are upregulated in hydrosalpinx, which might not favor the implantation. So they say at molecular level, there are certain changes that are happening, even though you don't evidently see fluid in the cavity. So they feel even if I'm not seeing any fluid in cavity, I still want to delink or remove those tubes if the tube is damaged and has a hydrosalpinx before going for an embryo transfer. Next, coming to hysteroscopy in an RIF. Now, hysteroscopy, many of the centers, even in Hyderabad, in fact, are doing a diagnostic hysteroscopy for all the IVF cases before going for embryo transfer. But there are cases where they are not doing for everybody, irrespective of any indication. A trophy trial was conducted. They included almost 350 recurrent implantation failure cases who had a normal scan. See, if you have a finding on scan, there is a polyp, people do hysteroscopy. There is that about it. But there is a normal scan, there is a 3D cavity also. Even then, if you want to do a hysteroscopy, did in the RIF patients, they are not understanding what be the reason. They went ahead. Just because they performed hysteroscopy, did it impact the results? No, there was no difference in the live birth rate, be it whether they did it or whether they did not before going for the next transfer. So hysteroscopy being performed is not still mandatory for all the IVF cases, but it is the different institution protocols or different doctors' decisions to go forward with it. Coming to lab. Now, diagnostic lab in all is not recommended. That is a very proper thing. Only go for lab when there is an abnormal HSG. There are some abnormal findings on scan like hydrosalpinx. Because even if you find certain subtle things like grade 1 endometriosis or small things, certain pelvic adhesions also, even if you treat them, even post that, they found there was not much difference. Yes, there was a little difference, but there was no difference in the live birth rate. All the studies, whatever you see, at the end of the day, what we want is the live birth rate. It is not just about positive or negative or miscarriage rate or ongoing pregnancy rate. What we concentrate is on the live birth rate. So if we find large studies which are showing a beneficial impact or beneficial effect on live birth rate, only then probably we will start going even for a diagnostic laparoscopy in cases of RIF. At present, it is not recommended. Now we finished from the gamete side, the genetics, the mother side. Now the endometrium, the uterus. In the uterus, structurally fibroids, adenomyosis and all we are looked into. Now we'll go to the lining, endometrium. At the level of endometrium, what all we need to look into? First one is an infection. Second is the microbiome. Third is the ERA endometrial receptivity array. And fourth is the altered expression of associated molecules. We have to look for any abnormality in any of these four factors that could be possible underlying causes for the implantation failure. In chronic endometritis, why do we think that will affect the implantation? In chronic endometritis, when they studied, they found that these women in their uterus, they had an altered distribution of the uterine natural killer cells, which are CD56. They found decreased levels, and there were increased CD16 lymphocytes. Because of this, there was an altered immune tolerance to the embryo, and that was affecting the implantation and defective trophoblastic invasion. Um, I'll, I'll try to be brief, but I'll try to explain. Now, let us say we have a lady with a kidney failure and she needs kidney. The doctors will try to find the donors in their family, that is the blood relatives, be it sisters, mother or brothers. Why are we only looking closely there? Because we feel if they are blood relatives, there will be more of matching, the genes matching. So probably she will accept the kidney better. But in case of a pregnancy, an embryo, when it is formed, it has half genes from the mother and half genes from the father. That means half of the embryo is completely foreign to the lady. Then why is the uterus not rejecting the embryo? It is allowing it to implant. In fact, it is nourishing it. It is giving blood supply and it is helping it to nourish. How is this happening? It is a semi allograft. It is not a completely 100% foreign genes. 50% of them are hers. So it is a semi allograft. But how is the semi allograft being accepted by the uterus? That is the beauty, or that is the miracle that God has created. He has created the uterine environment through your uterine natural killer cells. There are T cells, T helper, T cytotoxic, regulatory, multiple things, killer immunoglobulin receptors. Now, all these, they act in such a way that somehow they're able to accept the embryo if it is good. Now, in that, the different NK cells act differently. That is all in immunology. It is a very deep subject. I'll not go deep into it. So that's why they say chronic endometritis is somewhere affecting the natural killer cell milieu, which is supposed to be favorable. It is not being favorable and it can affect the implantation of the embryo. How can you diagnose? Mainly, there are multiple things given, but mainly it is hysteroscopy and histology. First one, hysteroscopy. A simple daycare office hysteroscopy is more than enough. It is gold standard. Is again histology, where we have to identify the plasma cells in the endometrial stroma using IHC stains for CD138. What are the hysteroscopic findings? Three things, remember: hyperemia, stromal edema, micropolyps. So these are the features. If you find on hysteroscopy, then it is signs of chronic endometritis and you have to treat it. Even among these three, very specific finding is the micropolyps. How do they look? I'll show the photo. So here you can see it is a very close-up view. In the first picture, you can see the stromal edema. We can see marked accentuation of all the vascular network that you can see. Next, sorry, that is the these are the micropolyps. Sorry. Now this is the hyperemia. You can see the red spots. Even they will say strawberry appearance also. Then last one is a stromal edema. Much more deeper microscopic picture of micropolyps is here. Can you see them? Very small protrusions. So if you're seeing the micropolyps, they are very specific feature for diagnosing chronic endometritis. They have high positive predictive value, as high as 98.4%. And whenever micropolyps are seen, they are almost always coexisting with stromal edema and hyperemia as well. Histological diagnosis, that is identifying presence of plasma cells in the endometrial stroma. We can do hematoxylin and eosin staining, but much more better would be a CD138 IHC immunohistochemistry staining. This is hematoxylin and eosin, but in this you can see very clearly the plasma cells which are shown as with arrows. These are the plasma cells. Now in each high power field, you can count the number of plasma cells. Different criteria have been given trying to say that these many plasma cells, if you see in these many high power fields, then yes, it is chronic endometritis. So it is different criteria, but quite often we take is 5 plasma cells per 10 high power fields. We consider it as an chronic endometritis. Treatment. Why treatment is important? One study showed that after treatment of chronic endometritis, the implantation rate as well as live birth rate both improved in cases of recurrent implantation failure. So that's why they say if nothing is understood, all comes normal, do a simple hysteroscopy, and if there is chronic endometritis, treat it, then maybe your subsequent transfer, the chances of being a success will be at least partially improved. Coming to treatment, generally the drug of choice is doxycycline, which is administered in doses of 100 milligrams twice a day for 14 days. Now, an alternative could be others like cephalosporins, macrolides, or even quinolones. Now, in particular, according to the CDC guidelines, therapies recommended are if the culture comes positive for gram-negative bacteria, you can give ciprofloxacin 500 milligrams twice a day for 10 days as first-line therapy. And if it is gram-negative bacteria, gram-positive bacteria, you can give amoxicillin plus clavulanate 1 gram twice daily for 8 days. And then if it is mycoplasma or ureaplasma ureolyticum infections, then you can give josamicin 1 gram twice a day for 12 days. While in case of persistence, you can give minocycline 100 milligrams twice a day for 12 days. In negative cultures, nothing's come, you can give ceftriaxone 250 milligrams IM in a single dose plus doxycycline 100 milligrams orally twice a day for 14 days with metronidazole 500 milligrams orally twice a day for 14 days. And then in case of persistent signs, whenever you find chronic endometritis on hysteroscopy and you treat her post-operatively with antibiotic course, nobody is doing a relook hysteroscopy just to see if the signs of chronic endometritis have disappeared. That means you saw micropolyps, you found stromal edema, you found hyperemia. That's why you have put her on this treatment. So will you go back and do hysteroscopy just to see that have those all those signs disappeared? Nobody does that. But in some cases you are not understanding or the reason, at times relook hysteroscopy is performed if all the other indicate reasons have been uh, eliminated but still the success is not coming in the case. Sometimes they go for a subsequent hysteroscopy. Coming to uterine microbiome, just like your gut microbiome, uterus also has microbiome. Once upon a time, it was thought that endometrium is sterile, but now we all know that it is lactobacillus that mainly colonizes the uterus along with the vagina. Morini et al. In 2018 showed that a lactobacillus dominated endometrium undergoing IVF will have a better chances of success or implantation compared to non-lactobacillus dominated endometrium. However, more studies are required. Few of us give probiotics in cases. All this probiotics, why we are giving is for the microbiome, healthy uterine microbiome. Coming to ERA, what are we doing? Just like the genes or cells that are present in the rest of the body, the endometrium also carries certain genes which are playing a role in implantation, out of which around at least 238 genes have been studied and something has proposed as window of implantation. Now, window of implantation is in a menstrual cycle, particular days where there is a highest chance of supporting a blastocyst acceptance. That is your window of implantation. Generally, it is opening on 19th to 20th day and it lasts for about 4 to 5 days at the time when progesterone reaches its peak serum concentration. Recently, a Spanish team, that is ERA tool, was developed by the Spanish team using a transcriptomic signature. In RIF patients, when they studied for the window of implantation, they found that it was displaced in almost 25.9% in the RIF people, not in the general population. That means what we do, we today the lining is good, we start progesterone, we give 5 days of injections, and the sixth day we are planning transfer, that is P plus 5. But in some ladies, probably this will not work because her window of implantation has either moved earlier or it has displaced to later. So her biopsy, when you send it, they will send certain hours. They say P plus 120 odd hours, 127 hours. So based on the time period that they provide in the result, we plan transfer at that particular time. So it's a customized array of 238 genes expressed at different stages of the endometrial cycle. ERA is linked to computational predictor identifying the receptivity status of the endometrial sample, and it will assess and give the personalized window of implantation in that lady. It is more accurate than endometrial histology, reproducible in the same patient for 29 to 40 months after the first test. The month in which you do an ERA test, you do a biopsy, so you can't do the transfer in that month. You get some window. Many doubts have raised that how long is this acceptable? Is this okay for the next month, for 3 months? Until then, it is valid. They said 29 to 40 months, but we still do not know because it can always change from month to month also. A picture transcriptomic signature will look something like that in different parts of her cycle. Evidence in RIF patients, different studies. Some said it was improved, some said there was no change. So different studies. Nalini Mahajan, our own person, she found that she's the one who found that the window of implantation was displaced in 25% of RIF patients. And she said after a personalized embryo transfer was provided, that is, ERA was done in all these cases. And in that particular window, when the embryo transfer was planned, her ongoing pregnancy rate in them was 42.4% and the implantation rate was 33%. Now, coming to immunology, I've talked about it. About the allograft, it is accepted. All cells that are playing a role in. We have natural killer cells, the T helper to T helper 2 ratio, HLA sharing, human leukocyte antigen, autoantibodies, APLA, inherited thrombophilia. All these are in your immunology and thrombophilia. First, natural killer cells. We have two. One is uterine natural killer cells. The other one is a peripheral natural killer cells. So we need a balance amidst this. Only then we'll have a good implantation. So it is the uterine natural killer cells which are CD56 bright and CD16 minus. They are little cytotoxic. They are source of cytokines. They help in trophoblast invasion and spiral artery modulation and immunoregulatory function. I'll tell an example which I've heard from a doctor, an expert in this immunology. He explained something. He said, a semi in this genes, HLA sharing. I said, for a kidney donor, you want somebody genes to match as much as yours so that the transplant is accepted better. But in a baby, it is not like that. The more genes are similar between the husband and wife, like HLA sharing, usually those people don't get success. Why? Because he showed a very funny but very understandable analogy. So what he said was, you are very relaxed at your home, sitting on your sofa in your night dress probably, and your brother is coming. The brother called and he said, I'm coming home. You don't do any special arrangements. You're just sitting watching TV because it's your brother. You don't have to prepare anything. But what if some relative is coming, some prospective partner is coming? What you do? You immediately go get dressed, arrange some food for them. So all of this, that means you're making some special preparations, you're making some effort for it. So that's why they say the more sharing is there, the uterus is not going to go out of its way or make any effort to create an environment for it. But if there is less of sharing, it will prepare a better environment, so it will allow the embryo to implant better. So there are multiple things. This is only from the HLA aspect. Now, you have natural killer and T helper cells also. All these are different studies. I'll not go into deep. This is. So conclusion is, at the end of the day, routine testing for natural killer cells is not recommended. Just because we have studies who say less use natural killer cells, success rates, doesn't mean you go to for all the cases you try natural killers. It should be the very, when immunol comes in picture, repeated failing in spite of embryo being euploid. That means you don't do PGTA, you have gone for 3 transfers, they have come negative. Now you don't do immunology, you first do PGTA. So only if you have a euploid blastocyst in hand, all the other factors have been corrected. Your uterus looks fine, no fibroid, no adenomyosis, no polyps, sperm DNA fragmentation has been corrected, everything being done. In spite of that, you're unable to give her a result, and the lady or the husband doesn't want donor cycles, they only want their self gametes, then you come to immunology. This is the last thing that you should see. So the routine testing, it is not recommended. It is in fact controversial. It is still investigational. Coming to T helper ratio, what is good? You have T helper 1, then you have T helper 2. T helper 1, they release all these cytokines. Interleukin 1, 2, 8, 12, 18, TNF alpha, interferon gamma, especially TNF alpha. So all these are little pro-inflammatory. T helper 2 are interleukin 4, 5, 6, 10, and 13, which are anti-inflammatory. Now you want a ratio where T helper 2 cells are more than T helper 1 for a good implantation. But doesn't mean absence of implantation, because the whole process of implantation, the embryo coming and attaching or penetrating the wall and sitting inside, ours is interstitial implantation in humans. So for this, it is a process. The process itself is an implantation. Without inflammation, implantation cannot occur. So you don't suppress it also. You should strike a balance. But in that balance, they say preferably T helper 2 should be more than the T helper 1. If you have a more T helper 1 than T helper 2, then mostly it is rejection. It will reject it and there's a complete implantation failure. So you at least want the implantation to happen. T helper 2 should be more in comparison to the T helper 1 cells. Again, cytokine production, all this can be assessed. The ratios they have discussed in different studies. HLA sharing. HLA sharing, I told that alloimmunity testing is not necessary because there is lack of studies to confirm that sharing of HLA between partners leads to IVF. Nowadays, they are coming up that this could be the reason. This is evolving. Hopefully, if it is proven, then it will become a thing in our daily practice also. But nowadays, they are saying that the sharing is causing IVF failure. That means in the pregnancy whole thing being equivalent to immunological aspect. Till now, infertility, WHO has accepted that it is pathological, just like your heart diseases, diabetes, just like that even WHO has recognized infertility as one of them. But still, it is not equating to immunological dysfunction. But probably there are numerous studies that they are trying to say that immunology is playing much larger part than what we are looking at. Next, APLA. APLA is also related to immunology only because you're looking at anti-phospholipid antibodies, lupus anticoagulant, then you're looking at the beta-2 microglobulin. No, all these beta-2 glycoprotein. No, all these are, yes, immunological aspects. APLA needs to be corrected. That everyone knows. The first thing we do if you have repeated failures is we go ahead and put blood thinners. That is oral aspirin or we are putting heparin. Next is inherited thrombophilia. Thrombophilia screening, many things. This you can do the MTHFR gene defects, polymorphisms, factor V Leiden mutations, prothrombin gene, antithrombin 3 deficiency. So all these can be looked into as a part of thrombophilia for treatment accordingly. Autoantibodies, anti-thyroid antibody, anti-nuclear antibody, mainly the first two. Management. First, lifestyle modifications. Yes, we do many things. You change your medication, you do the embryo testing, you do everything. But also, we need some effort from the couple side, from the lady side particularly, because if she's obese or overweight, we have to tell her the lifestyle changes. We have to explain her about the importance of exercises and dieting and the weight reduction. Next is smoking. We know the how smoking is affecting then the stress levels. So all these have to be managed. Second is from the gametes and from oocyte. How do you alter the oocyte quality? Intrinsic her oocyte quality because of some poor reserve or PCOD, oh, that's all right. But your protocol also should be tailored to her. What type of gonadotropins you're using, what kind of dosage you're using, what is the trigger strategy that you're going to follow in her. You have to individualize and do it better so that the better outcomes are there. Second is sperm. If there's an elevated DFI, treat for it. From embryo aspect, yes, do a PGTA. Other things that you can do for improved chances of implantation, aim for a blastocyst transfer instead of a cleavage. Also try assisted hatching. Assisted hatching, contradictory. Some studies say there is improved chances, some say not much, no difference. So assisted hatching, wherein you put a laser, make a hole, you allow the hatching of blastocysts and then plan the transfer. Next is you also concentrate in your ET technique, how you're doing it. Sequential transfer. Sequential transfer is you do one transfer on day 3 and then you do the second transfer just one day apart on day 5. But it's contradictory. Next is freeze-all. That is mainly in hyper-responders like PCOD, because in PCOD, to plan fresh transfer, one is OHSS risk we don't want to do. Second is even in spite of that, if someone wants to do, the results will not be great because your estrogen levels are very high in hyper-responders, which is not physiologically good for an endometrium for implantation time. So that's why I go for a frozen transfer. Next, embryo glue. Moderate quality evidence for improvement in clinical pregnancy rate and live birth rate, also associated with increase in multiple pregnancies when you are transferring more than one embryo. Improving endometrial receptivity. How to improve it? You correct all the anatomical defects, all the fibroid, polyps, adenomyosis, you correct them. Second, you can do an endometrial scratch. Third, GCSF installation. The last two, endometrial scratch and GCSF installation, they almost work similarly. They colonize or they invite all the neutrophils in that area, the growth factors and the cytokines, and they say probably there is an improved endometrium that you will gain. So endometrial scratch increasing cytokines involved in wound healing, such as the leukemia inhibitory factor and interleukin 11. Both are important in implantation. Recent studies are showing contradictory evidence to the earlier belief of improved outcome, but still many are practicing this. Next, these are the various evidences for the endometrial scratch. Next, GCSF. This is also increasing the decidualization by apocrine and paracrine action and improves the endometrial receptivity. Immunotherapy. When the immunology level, like NK cells, T helper cells, HLA, at these level, there are different therapies like glucocorticoids, IV immunoglobulins, intralipids, peripheral blood mononuclear cells, then paternal lymphocyte infusion therapy or donor lymphocyte infusion therapy. All cannot be used in a generalized fashion for everyone. There are indications for each one. Now, in glucocorticoids, you can use them when there is a reduced NK cell count to stabilize the cytokine production. IVIG immunoglobulins, what it is, it will reduce the peripheral cytotoxic NK cells and enhances the regulatory T cells. Intralipids, it will help in suppressing the pro-inflammatory cytokines. That is when you have high T helper 1 cells also. Next is peripheral blood mononuclear cells. This is not practiced much. Paternal LIT. This LIT comes into picture when there is a sharing, more amount of HLA sharing. Tacrolimus, again in immunology, it is a drug to reject allorejection. Adalimumab is TNF alpha blocking antibody. TNF alpha is the inflammatory cytokine released by T helper 1. So when you have an elevated T helper 1 to T helper 2 ratio, this might help. Now, all this immunotherapy that I talked about, you cannot directly just write it to any patient. You need a specialized person for it. You have to talk to those experts. Now, they will help you based on the lady's profile, the weight, that what dosage needs to be given, or in whom certain therapies are contraindicated. So, you have to be very careful when you are giving immunotherapies. So we have separate immunologists who are available now. They have to be consulted before we provide immunotherapy to the patients. Now, last is the empirical treatment with aspirin and heparin in APLA cases. Now, these are the various things that you can do in an RIF lady. Now, what all could be the causes, what all you will evaluate, and then what all can be done in these cases. Now, that brings me to the end of the class. If anyone has any doubts, you can please ask. I know I cannot do justice completely to the RAF, but if somebody has any doubt, I'll try to clarify.
Madam, any role of torch infections, madam?
No, ma'am. Completely not there. Because torch profile, even now I see many of the peripheries, the doctors are prescribing even for recurrent pregnancy losses. Actually, neither of them. Because torch, all the infections that you're looking for, they're all endemic. So even you or me, if we get a torch test done, we are being exposed to the viruses. So we will automatically develop antibodies to it. Sometimes it is good that we have these IgG antibodies. And in the torch also, we have rubella test. Many of the fertility centers nowadays, they do the rubella test. And if they don't have the IgG antibodies, they're actually vaccinating them for it and then starting treatment also. Torch, no role in RIF also, no role in